This is going to be a super quick introduction to motion design. Similar to other types of design, motion is something that we see quite often and oftentimes don't pay all that much attention to. But the designers behind that work have to think about it quite a bit. And so that's what I want to talk about today. Everything from branding and advertising to app design and UI design uses motion, so much so that brands have established their own motion graphic style guides, as we saw with the example of Klarna. So, motion is such an important part of the way that the brand is experienced that they have had to document the principles of how things move when the brand is communicating. Now, traditionally, the tool to use when it comes to creating motion graphics is After Effects. After Effects is a beast unto itself in terms of Adobe software, and it is still the industry standard for creating motion graphics. But we are getting other tools, and the UI in After Effects is so complicated that it really makes sense to onboard folks in a bit of a simpler tool. So, we are going to take a look at a tool called Jitter today, which you can think of as kind of like the Canva of motion graphics. So, Jitter is a web based tool, just like something like Figma is, and it's a bit of a simplified motion graphics editor. Before we jump into actually how to use it, we should talk about some of the principles of motion graphics. So I'm going to jump over here into a canvas that's already set up. And we're just going to take a look at this example of this ellipse moving across the screen. So a few things that you'll notice here are the timeline down at the bottom. So obviously this is time, and then you can see we have layers of motion here. The other thing, if I select that ellipse, you'll see over here in the editor some of the properties like you'd expect in any other motion editor. The thing to note here is thinking about motion graphics in terms of editing a property over time. So in this case, we are editing the x coordinate. It is moving from the x coordinate of 0 to about 1500, and it's taking about 3 seconds to do that. So it starts at 0, moves across over to 1500. Now, this is pretty boring. It doesn't have a whole lot of personality to it. And we can see that by comparing it to a different way that this ellipse could move over the same period of time. So both of these ellipses start and end at the same time. It takes the same amount of time for them to make that movement. But the second one is obviously a little bit more interesting because there is a change in velocity here. So the second ellipse starts out slow, speeds up, and then slows down. That's actually more like how most things move in the real world. Things have to gain speed, and then to slow to a stop, they have to slow down. So, how do we edit these things and how do we visualize them in a motion graphics tool? So, if I select the animation on ellipse 1, over here in animation, you can see under easing, I have a custom animation setup. And when we look at motion graphics, we actually look at it on a graph. So if you came to design school thinking that you were going to escape algebra and physics, I'm sorry to tell you that that's not the case. In the motion graph editor, which is what this is a simplified representation of, we think about movement in terms of an x and y axis. On the x axis, we have time, so that's the duration of the animation. And then on the y-axis, we have the change in whatever the property is. In this case, it's the movement across the x-axis. So you can think of it as 0 down here and that 1500 number up here. And then if we follow the graph over time, it is consistently changing location until it gets to the end here. If we compare that to something like ellipse 2, I'll give you a second just to think about that. How might this graph change in order to represent a slow start and then speeding up in the middle and then slowing down at the end? So I'll switch over to that now. And you'll see that ellipse 2 is following a much more of an S curve. So this graph starts by changing very little over the first third, and then suddenly the x value changes quite a bit in the middle third here, and then it slows down at the end. And we can actually see this change in real time. So if we wanted it to start very fast and then slow down at the end and take a long time to slow down, we could grab this handle here and change this curve so that it changes very quickly over a short period of time and then slows down quite a bit at the end. And you can see what that does to our movement down here. We could do the same thing in the opposite direction. Perhaps we want it to move very slowly at first and then speed up right at the end. And we can even create things like overshoot or anticipation by breaking the final value or the initial value. So, for example, if we want this circle or this ellipse to kind of move backwards in anticipation of moving forward, kind of like it's storing up some energy, we could do something like this, where it moves back at first, so it dips below that zero value, and then it speeds up. So Jitter is pretty friendly in that you don't have to build these motion curves as custom curves yourself. There's actually some defaults built into here. So I can open up the easing here, and you can see I'm working in custom right now. But there's all these curves already built in here. So you can see that the none is what the top one is moving at. We change it to something like impulse, which is that anticipation. You can get a little preview here where this square is kind of winding up and then speeding up. That's what that looks like. You can overshoot where it moves beyond the final value. If I hide this, you'll be able to see that a little better. And then you can, of course, edit these by opening that up, and then you can kind of change the strength of that initial curve. So here you can think about the personality of whatever the movement is, how you want your graphic to move, and then edit it on the motion curve. The other thing you can look at is how long that movement takes. So not just thinking about acceleration and velocity, but how short or fast is it? And we can change that down here on the timeline. Could make this happen much sooner. And I'll hide our first one here while we're working on this. Or we could make it start much later. Or we could stretch it out over a longer period of time. So that's a brief introduction to the animation side of the editor. The design side of the editor should look very familiar, so I won't spend a bunch of time on that. But let's talk a little bit about how to actually put this into practice and make something useful. So the most important thing to remember is you shouldn't jump straight into the tool and start designing. You should start with sketching and you should start with ideation. And for motion graphics, we do this through something called a storyboard. So in my example here, I'm creating a little pre-roll or bumper reel for a YouTube ad for my brand. And it's going to have some typography that comes onto the screen, and then it's going to move off, and afterwards the logo is going to come up. So you can see here I'm thinking through, what is the video start on? What appears over time? It's going to say your data crowdsourced, and these are going to slide up with these bubble elements in the background. And then the text is going to slide off as the logo comes up. and this is where the video will end. Here's what that might look like in the end. And I'll also show you how to work with typography in here. So you can see the letters come up one at a time, and then both words or both lines slide off the screen, and then the logo comes up underneath. So I'm going to build this out step by step. If you just want to jump into it and get started playing around, you can stop the video here. Or if you want to see kind of step by step how to build something like this, stick around. So I actually made this layout a little bit small for a final video. So in my next artboard, I'm actually going to fix that. I will start with a new artboard, this icon up here. And this, I'm going to change my preset to 1920 by 1080. And YouTube pre-rolls are 6 seconds in duration, so I'm just going to change that now. So the first thing to talk about is how to get something like this background video here. We've talked in the past about how to get royalty-free photography. You can also do this for video. The first place that I usually stop is a place called Pexels. This is a royalty-free image site, but they also happen to have video. So here I might search for something like bubbles. You can see all these here are royalty-free. This is the one I used, so I'm just going to grab this one. And I'll download this at 1920 by 1080. Okay, so now that that's downloaded, I can drop it in here with the media button. There it is. And here's my video. So already you can see down here on the animation timeline how this is playing over the entire duration of the animation. And you can see that I got this to be closer to the blue that is my brand identity here. Normally, the best way to do this would be to actually do some color correction on your video and edit it that way. We don't have that option in Jitter. So what I'm going to do instead is draw a rectangle over my entire canvas. And in the Design tab, I'm going to edit the color of this rectangle to be closer to my brand color and just make it a little bit more saturated because the video behind that is going to darken it quite a bit. And then I'm going to reduce the opacity. And that looks a little bit better and closer to what I'm looking for. The other thing I'm going to do, because I'm throwing text and graphics over top of this video, is I'm going to apply just a little bit of blur so that it's easier to read whatever's in front of this video. Okay, so now let's grab some text, and I'm going to do this on 2 lines. So first I'll type your data, because my brand is a crowdsourced data product. And in the Design tab, I'm going to change this to something a little closer to my brand font. In fact, what did I use up here? PT Sans. Probably did some searching earlier when I put this together. Change this to white so we can read it. And then make this quite a bit larger. Okay. I'm just going to copy paste that line there. To get my second line, and then I'm also going to increase the weight of this. And I'm putting those on 2 separate lines just so this is a little more dynamic. And now we can start editing. So I'm going to hide the second line of text at first, so we're just working with this. And then we're going to jump into the Animate tab. So I'm going to add a new animation on text 1. When I click this, you'll see We get a few options, some ways to animate this in onto the screen, some ways to animate it out, or we can set up some custom ones here, which we'll look at later. But let's use one of the preset ones for now. And then you can see some of the different options here previewed. The one that this is using is actually mask in our example. You can see the text appears from a mask below its final position and slides into its final point. And then if I leave this on loop, I'll let this play over. So you can see that it's sliding in one word at a time. I'm actually going to make this a little bit longer. I'm going to move this to the front of the timeline. And then I'm going to change it from text animation from words actually to letters. And you'll see that changes it so that the letters are animating on one at a time instead of the words. Now this is quite long, and I also think that comma is comically slow coming on, and the smoothing is on slowed down. So the effect parameters are how these are animating from the mask, and then the text animation is for the entire animation. How is this playing out over time? I'm actually going to change this to something closer to like smooth or natural. And then I'm going to see how short we can get this. In here, we're balancing the length of this, and then again, those easing parameters. So I think that's pretty good. I'm going to edit this to slow down just a little bit at the end. So by decreasing the influence of this motion curve, you can see it's flattening out. That looks pretty good to me. And then I'm going to unhide text 2. And what I can actually do is paste that animation onto text 2. We play these together. This is how this is looking. I think that's too slow for that one. Maybe these should overlap just a little bit. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So the next thing I want to do is move these lines off of the canvas. So to do that, I'm actually going to use a custom animation just so we can experiment with that. So I have text 1 selected, this your data part. I'm going to hit new animation, and then I'm going to select custom. Here we select the property that we want to animate, and we want to animate the movement. Instead of the X movement, I actually want to animate this on the Y axis. So I'm just going to put a number in there so I can see the change. This first dot here is where the animation starts. The second dot is where it ends. So I can just move this up off the canvas, and you'll see over that time, this slides up and off the canvas. That's actually not too bad as it is. So I'm going to take that animation and apply it to text 2. And then I just want to overlap these just slightly so one starts and then the other follows it. Except I need to change the end of this because it doesn't quite make it all the way up off the canvas. And the second one, I'm going to have it end just a little bit higher because I don't like how we see it slowing down at the end. Maybe that one needs just a little more time. And then maybe instead of smooth, we want these to just accelerate. Shorten these just a little. Okay, that's looking pretty good. The last thing I want to do here is bring the logo onto the screen. And in fact, to meet this 6-second goal, I might have to shorten some of this. Okay, I'm going to place the white SVG using the media icon now. So there's our logo. I'm going to scale this holding shift to make sure we maintain our aspect ratio. Go ahead and center this up. And then we'll add an animation to our logo. We're going to do custom again. So new animation, custom. I want to move this. I don't want to move it on the x-axis. I actually want to move it on the y. So this time, instead of changing our ending, we're going to have to fix that. We want the start to start down here. And we want it to end in the center of the screen. So that actually looks pretty good. I want to be able to see some of this as the other text is leaving. So I'm going to slide that back a little bit. And the speed is matched pretty well. So that looks good to me. And let's take a look at the whole thing. Okay, so that looks pretty good, and that was pretty fast for a simple animation. In order to get this out of here, we are going to get a watermark on this because we're using a free version of this tool, but that's okay. I'm going to go to export. I'm going to export this at, we'll just do at 720, since that's the max we can do here. This will take just a second to render that out. And then we can download that. And there we are. This is our final animation.